Episode 3, Fields of Blood. There are places on earth that remember violence. Not metaphorically, though we often speak of landscapes as bearing witness, as holding memory. But literally, physically, the soil chemistry changes. Where many bodies decompose together, where blood soaks into the ground in quantities that overwhelm the earth's capacity to absorb it, the composition of the soil itself is altered. Nitrogen levels spike. Phosphorus concentrations increase. The pH shifts. Plants respond to these changes. Some species refuse to grow in such soil, while others thrive in it, creating patterns visible for decades or even centuries. Modern soil science can detect these signatures. Medieval and early modern peasants, lacking such technical knowledge, simply observed the results. There were fields where, after battles, nothing would grow. The earth had drunk too deeply of death. Stand with me now in a field near the village of Hikala in Kurkajoki, not far from the main road that Theodore Schwint would have traveled in 1879. The field is called Sakararo. It looks ordinary now. If you visited it today, you would see grass, perhaps some wildflowers, the usual growth of a northern European meadow. Birds sing. Insects buzz. There is nothing to mark this ground as special. But dig down, if you dare, a meter into the soil. Turn over the earth with a spade. And if you are unlucky, or perhaps fortunate, depending on your perspective, you will find them, bones. Human bones. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Scattered without pattern, without the careful arrangement of a proper burial. Jumbled together as if thrown there hastily, as if the living had neither the time nor the strength to do more than cover the dead with a thin layer of soil. This is Sakararo. This is where the earth drank blood knee-deep. This is where Sweden's armies met their match, where empires changed hands, where the grass refused to grow for 7 times 7 years. This is a field of blood. The geography of war. To understand why battles raged across these particular fields, you must understand the Lake Ladoga region's cursed strategic position. Look at a map. The lake sits at the intersection of multiple territorial claims and cultural boundaries. To the west, the Kingdom of Sweden, which included Finland as a subordinate territory, pushed eastward, seeking to expand its influence and control over lucrative trade routes. To the east, the Principality of Novgorod, later absorbed into the expanding Russian state, pushed westward with the same goals. Between them lay Karelia, valuable for its resources, its waterways, and its position as a buffer zone. For the people living in this borderland, the strategic importance of their home was a curse. Armies needed to cross this territory to attack each other. Forts and castles needed to be built, garrisoned, and supplied. Local populations could be taxed, conscripted, or simply plundered to support military operations. And crucially, neither side could afford to let the other control the region unopposed. Every Swedish advance provoked a Russian counterattack. Every Russian fortification prompted a Swedish siege. The result was centuries of intermittent but recurring warfare, with the local population caught between the grinding stones of imperial ambition. The worst period, the one that dominates the folk memory Schwint collected, was the Great Northern War and its aftermath, spanning roughly 1700 to 1721. This conflict, which involved most of Northern Europe, saw Swedish and Russian armies march and countermarch across the Lake Ladoga region repeatedly. Villages were burned, populations displaced, fields devastated. The period became known in Finnish and Karelian memory as Isoviha, the Great Wrath, or the Great Hatred. But wars had come before, and wars would come after. The specific conflicts blurred together in folk memory, creating a composite image of the wartime, or, when the Swedes came, a period when normal life became impossible and survival itself was uncertain. Sakararo and the other battlefields remembered in song and story were products of this endless conflict. They were places where the violence that usually spread itself across the landscape concentrated, where many men died in a short time, where the earth itself bore witness. Sakararo, the story. Let me tell you what people told Theodore Schwint about Sakararo. The field lay near the main road through Kurkajoki, visible from the path, impossible to avoid if you traveled through the region. Everyone knew it. Everyone had stories about it. The battle, or battles, accounts varied, had happened when the land changed hands, when the border between Swedish and Russian control shifted. Which specific conflict this referred to was unclear, possibly the Great Northern War, possibly an earlier engagement, possibly multiple battles conflated into a single memory. The details of armies and generals and dates had been forgotten. What remained was the visceral, terrible core of the experience. Swedish armies had come. They met resistance, whether from Russian regular troops, local militia, or some combination, the stories didn't specify. The fighting had been desperate. Men fought with swords, pikes, early firearms, whatever weapons they possessed. The battle had raged for hours, perhaps days. And the killing had been extraordinary. The blood was knee-deep, one old man told Schwint. Not ankle-deep. Not splattered across the ground. Knee-deep. An image so visceral, so impossible to forget, that it had passed down through generations as the defining characteristic of Sakararo. Whether this was literally true or hyperbole born of trauma, it captured something essential: the battle had been a slaughter. When the fighting ended, the field was carpeted with the dead. Hundreds of bodies, perhaps more, lay where they had fallen. The survivors, exhausted, traumatized, themselves often wounded, faced the grim task of dealing with the corpses. They did not have the strength for proper burials. They did not have the time. Armies might return, new threats might emerge, or they simply needed to flee while flight was still possible. And there were too many dead. Far too many. So they gathered the bodies, dragged them to a nearby hillside called Humernmaki, and created a mass grave. Not individual plots with wooden markers and prayers. Not even carefully arranged bodies with arms folded and faces covered. They threw the dead into pits, jumbled together, scattered bones and rotting timber, and covered them with soil. Scattered bones and rotting timber, no coffins for the dead, as the song remembers. The earth itself remembers how the ground ran red. And then came the strangest part of the story, the detail that convinced later generations that something supernatural had occurred at Sakararo. Nothing would grow there. Year after year, spring after spring, the field remained barren while fields around it greened and prospered. The grass refused to sprout. Wildflowers avoided the soil. Even weeds, those opportunistic plants that colonize any disturbed ground, seemed reluctant to take root. For 7 times 7 years, people said. 49 years of barren ground, as if the earth itself was mourning, or cursed, or simply too full of death to support life. Whether this was literal truth or folk exaggeration, we cannot know. But it captured a psychological truth: some violences are so extreme they seem to poison the very ground they occur on. Some places, after terrible events, feel wrong in ways that persist. The scattered killing fields. Sakararo was not unique. Across the Lake Ladoga region, Schwint encountered story after story of battle sites, mass graves, fields where extraordinary violence had occurred. At Silenkova, in the Luka district, old men recounted battles where the blood rose to our kneecaps when the warriors did fall. The imagery echoed Sakararo, this fixation on blood depth, as if the precise measurement of gore was crucial to conveying the battle's intensity. Perhaps it was. Perhaps when you are trying to communicate the incomprehensible to later generations, you reach for the most concrete, physical details you can recall. At Elisenvara, a sandy hill concealed a massive grave. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of warriors lay buried there, men who had fought for their homeland, but which homeland? Sweden? Russia? Karelia itself, and met their final doom in the shifting sands. The grave was discovered accidentally, people said, when someone dug too deeply for some forgotten purpose and encountered bones. At Lake Ladoga, the legendary Jocko Puntis, whom we will meet properly in a future episode, had fought against invaders. The specific details were lost, but the location remained: this shore, this beach, this piece of ground where a hero made his stand. At Ikojarvi, battles had raged at the bridges. This made strategic sense. Bridges were choke points, places where armies had to cross, where small forces could hold off larger ones, where desperate last stands occurred. At every bridge and crossing, at every narrow strait, the blood of thousands mingled, sealed by violent fate. Everywhere Schwint traveled, he encountered these memories. Nearly every village had its tale of the wartime, its mass grave, its field that wouldn't grow grass, its story of ancestors who had hidden in caves or fled to the forests while soldiers ravaged the land below. The sheer density of these stories is revealing. This was not a region that experienced war occasionally, as an aberration. War was a regular feature of life, something that came every generation or two, something you had to plan for and survive if you could. The people between empires. Try to imagine what it meant to live in the Lake Ladoga region during these centuries of conflict. You are a farmer. Your family has worked this land for generations. You know every field, every stream, every hillock. You have built a life here, a small house, a barn for your animals, fields cleared from forests through backbreaking labor. You have children. You have neighbors. You have a community. And then word comes: an army is approaching. You don't know which army, Swedish or Russian, the distinctions blur, and in practice both are equally dangerous to you. Armies need food, and they will take it from your stores whether you consent or not. They need shelter, and they will occupy your house, displacing you. They need fodder for their horses, and your winter grain will serve. If you resist, you will be killed. If you cooperate, you will be impoverished, left with nothing to survive the winter. Worse, you might be conscripted. Young men, and not so young men, when the armies grew desperate, could be forced into service. Dragged away from home to fight in wars they barely understood, for causes that meant nothing to them, in uniforms of whichever side happened to control the region that month. And if battle came to your area, the consequences were catastrophic. Fields would be trampled. Houses burned, either deliberately or as collateral damage. Livestock slaughtered for food or sport. Women and girls faced violence that the historical record only hints at but that everyone understood. Your choices were limited and terrible. You could flee, gather what you could carry, abandon your home, and try to reach safety in the forests or in one of the fortress mountains we discussed in the last episode. This meant leaving behind everything you couldn't transport: your house, your fields, the tools of your livelihood. You might return after the army passed to find nothing left. Or you could hide. The landscape around Lake Ladoga is riddled with caves, crevices in the granite bedrock, natural shelters beneath cliff faces. During war times, people retreated to these refuges, sometimes for days or weeks, emerging only when they were certain the danger had passed. Schwint heard many stories of these hiding places. At Sakararo itself, people had fled to cavern depths with all that they held dear, while the battle raged. At various fortress mountains, caves beneath the walls provided additional shelter, not just from military attack but from the chaos and lawlessness that accompanied armies. One particularly vivid tale, which we'll encounter fully in a later episode, tells of Vepsa, the last survivor of Lapinlahti. When invaders burned his village, killing everyone, Vepsa hid in the marshes, breathing through a hollow reed while soldiers and their dogs searched for survivors. He emerged days later to find his entire world destroyed, every house burned, every person he knew dead. He became a ghost haunting ruins, the lone witness to annihilation. Such stories were not fanciful exaggerations. They represented real experiences, real trauma, real survival strategies in a landscape where violence was recurring and escape often impossible. The impossible choices of borderland life. There's a particular cruelty to life in a contested borderland that's worth pausing to consider. When you live in the heartland of an empire, whether Moscow or Stockholm, war is something that happens elsewhere. Armies march away to distant frontiers. Battles occur in places you've never seen. You might pay taxes to support the war effort, you might lose sons to conscription, but your own home, your own fields, your own community remains intact. But in the borderlands, war comes to you. Your home is the distant frontier where battles occur. Your fields are the battlefields. Your community is where soldiers pillage. Worse, you have no control over which empire claims you. Borders shift based on decisions made hundreds of miles away by people who have never seen your village and would not recognize your name. One year you are Swedish subjects, the next year Russian, and you have no say in the matter. Yet each shift brings consequences: new laws, new taxes, new religious authorities, new administrators who speak different languages and have different expectations. And each shift brings danger. When control changes, there are always score settling, retaliation against those who cooperated with the previous regime, suspicion of those who might still be loyal to the departed power. The safest strategy is to try to remain invisible, to avoid taking sides, to cooperate minimally with whoever holds power at the moment while maintaining enough distance to avoid deep entanglement. But this strategy has its own costs. Communities that refuse to commit to either side fully are trusted by neither. They are vulnerable to reprisals from both. And in the chaos of actual warfare, neutrality offers no protection. Soldiers from both armies will plunder neutral villages just as readily as enemy villages. The people of the Lake Ladoga region navigated these impossible choices for centuries. Some communities developed reputations as Swedish-leaning, others as Russian-leaning. Some tried to play both sides, sending delegations to whichever army approached to negotiate, offering supplies in hopes of avoiding destruction. Some simply fled repeatedly, becoming practiced at evacuation, at hiding valuables, at returning to rebuild after each devastation. And some fought. They formed militia units, defended their fortress mountains, resisted raiders and armies when resistance seemed possible. These defensive actions, while often ultimately futile against professional military forces, were remembered in song and story. They became the basis for hero tales like that of Jocko Puntus, the shepherd warrior who fought for his people. But whether they fled, hid, negotiated, or fought, the people of the borderland paid a terrible price for living in a strategically valuable location. The physical evidence. Theodor Schwint, walking through these landscapes in 1879, saw physical evidence of the violence that folk memory preserved. At Sakararo, if you dug, you found bones. Human bones, scattered without pattern, without proper burial. The same was true at Humranmaki, where the mass grave lay. At Elisenvara, the sandy hill yielded skeletal remains when disturbed. At multiple sites, he was told about discoveries of weapons, rusted swords, broken pike heads, musket balls, pieces of armor. These were plowed up from fields, found in forest clearings, recovered from the shores of the lake. Each was a small testament to violence long past. In some places, there were still visible battle scars on the landscape. Trees that had grown around embedded metal, musket balls that struck wood instead of flesh, becoming incorporated into the tree as it grew, creating hard spots that would break a saw blade if someone tried to cut timber there. Defensive earthworks, not as impressive as the fortress mountains but still visible as ridges and depressions in fields, marking where soldiers had dug trenches and thrown up barriers. And everywhere, there were the ruins. Burned farmsteads, never rebuilt. Foundation stones marking where houses once stood but stood no longer. Churches destroyed in war, their sites marked only by scattered masonry and local memory. Modern archaeology has confirmed much of what the folk memory preserved. Excavations at Sakararo and other battle sites have yielded exactly what you would expect: mass graves, weapons, evidence of burning and destruction layers in the soil corresponding to known war periods. The violence was real. The scale of death was real. The trauma that etched these events into cultural memory for generations was earned through actual, horrific experience. The ecology of violence. Return to that question of why grass wouldn't grow at Sakararo for 49 years. Modern soil science offers possible explanations. A battlefield where hundreds die creates unusual soil conditions. Bodies decomposing en masse release enormous quantities of nitrogen and other nutrients, but in concentrations that can actually inhibit plant growth rather than promote it. The soil becomes temporarily toxic, not poisoned in the chemical sense, but ecologically unbalanced. Blood itself, in large quantities, alters soil pH significantly. It's acidic, and many plants that thrive in neutral or slightly alkaline soils will struggle in blood-soaked earth until the pH normalizes, which can take years or decades depending on soil type and rainfall patterns. There's also the psychological dimension. If local people believed the ground was cursed or contaminated, they might have avoided it, refusing to plant there even when the soil had physically recovered. The barrenness could be partly self-fulfilling, a field that no one sows will produce no crops, and the absence of cultivation would itself slow the soil's recovery. But perhaps most interesting is what happens with selective plant growth. Some plant species actually thrive in disturbed, nutrient-rich soils created by mass graves. There are documented cases of battlefields where specific wildflowers, particularly poppies, which have become symbolically associated with war remembrance, bloom with unusual vigor on ground where many died. Other plants avoid such soil. The result can be a patchwork where nothing grows in some areas while unusual growth appears in others, creating visible patterns that persist for years. An observant peasant, seeing such patterns, might well describe it as, the grass refused to grow, even if some vegetation was technically present. However it happened, the folk memory captured a truth: Sakararo was different. The ground there had been changed by violence in ways that were observable and that persisted across decades. Memory and forgetting. By the time Schwint visited in 1879, the worst of the violence was more than a century in the past. The Great Northern War had ended in 1721. The borderland conflicts had not ceased entirely, but they had diminished in frequency and intensity. The Lake Ladoga region had enjoyed relative peace for several generations. Yet the memories remained vivid. Old men who had never seen a battle themselves could tell you in detail about Sakararo, about the knee-deep blood, about the mass graves. The stories had been passed down carefully, preserved as warnings and as monuments to the dead. Why did these particular memories persist when so much else was forgotten? Partly, it was the physical evidence. As long as bones kept turning up in fields, as long as mass graves were occasionally disturbed, the memory of why they were there had to be maintained. The dead themselves, in a sense, refused to let the living forget. Partly, it was trauma. Experiences of extreme violence create memories that lodge themselves in cultural consciousness in ways that peaceful times do not. Happy, prosperous years blend together into an unremarkable continuity. But war years, those are counted, dated, remembered as breaks in the normal order of things. And partly, it was intentional preservation. Communities made choices about what to remember and how to remember it. The stories of battlefields served purposes. They taught younger generations about the dangers of war, about the importance of the fortress mountains, about the need for vigilance and preparation. They honored the dead, giving meaning to their sacrifice. They maintained cultural identity in the face of changing political control. Forgetting the battlefields would have been a kind of betrayal, betrayal of the dead, betrayal of the survivors who had lived through the horror, betrayal of the truth about what life in the borderlands had actually cost. So the memories were kept alive, spoken aloud, passed down. Until finally Theodor Schwint arrived with his notebook and wrote them down, creating another kind of memorial, a written record that could outlast even oral tradition. The universal battlefield. The fields of blood around Lake Ladoga are not unique. Every region that has experienced intensive warfare has its Sakararos, places where violence concentrated, where many died, where the ground itself seems to remember. France has the killing fields of Verdun, where artillery bombardment was so intense that the soil still yields up bones and unexploded shells more than a century later. Belgium has Flanders, where poppies grow on graves by the hundreds of thousands. America has Gettysburg, Antietam, the wilderness, battlefields where the magnitude of death shocked even those accustomed to war's brutality. These places serve similar functions across cultures. They are memorials, yes, but more than that. They are evidence. They are testaments. They are refusals to forget. Walking a battlefield, even centuries after the violence, you often feel something. Perhaps it's simply the power of knowledge. Knowing what happened here, you project emotion onto the landscape. Or perhaps places do hold memory in ways we don't fully understand, in the soil and the stones and the very air. Whatever the explanation, battlefields matter. They matter because they tell truths about human nature and human history that we need to confront. We are capable of terrible violence. We create hells on earth with depressing regularity. We kill each other in numbers that beggar imagination, for causes that later generations often struggle to understand or that seem, in retrospect, not worth a single life, let alone thousands. The fields of blood are reminders of this capacity. And they are warnings: this happened here. It could happen again. It is happening now, somewhere, to people who did not choose to live in a borderland but who were simply born there. Standing on Sakararo. Imagine yourself standing on the field now. The grass grows thick. Wildflowers bloom in summer. There is no monument, no marker, nothing to indicate that anything extraordinary ever occurred here. But you know. You carry the knowledge Schwint preserved, the memory the old men shared, the song that was written to ensure these events would not be forgotten. Beneath your feet, if you dug down, you would find them. The bones of men whose names are lost, who fought for causes they might not have fully understood, who died in agony on this ground and were thrown into mass graves without ceremony or dignity. They have been here for 300 years, give or take. They will be here for 300 more, slowly becoming part of the soil, their calcium feeding the grass, their phosphorus nourishing the wildflowers, their very substance becoming landscape. This is what happens to the dead in forgotten wars. They fertilize fields. They become geology. Their stories, if they're lucky, become folklore, preserved not in accurate historical detail but in the emotional truth of what was experienced and what was lost. The fields of blood are everywhere if you know how to look for them. They are beneath parking lots and shopping centers. They are under wheat fields and vineyards. They are in forests where trees grow from soil enriched by the decomposition of thousands. Most have been forgotten entirely. We walk over them daily, unaware of the violence that once occurred there, of the bodies that lie beneath our feet. But some are remembered. Some, through the work of people like Schwint, through songs and stories and the stubborn refusal of communities to forget their own history, remain present in cultural memory. Sakararo is one of these. The grass grows there now. But the memory remains, if we choose to listen for it. The earth remembers how the ground ran red.